Reading for Module 1 registers genres and styles, fundamental varieties of language. 1.1 Text varieties in your daily life. Before you begin this course, take a minute to think about all the different kinds of text that you encounter over the course of a normal day. In the morning, maybe you have a conversation with a housemate. As you have breakfast, you might listen to a radio announcer or read the news online. Then, you might send a text to a friend or family member. As you get ready for a class, you might proofread a paper that is due that day or look over the reading you did for homework. When you attend the class, you probably talk with friends, listen to lecture, and write notes. And that's just the first few hours of your day. For most people, conversation is the most common type of spoken language that they produce. But people typically listen to many different kinds of spoken language: television shows, commercials, radio or television news report, classroom lecture, political speeches, sermons, etc. Written language also plays a very important role in daily life for many people. Students produce many different kinds of writing at school: notes during class sessions, written assignments, term papers, essay on exam, and probably also text messages and or email messages. But as with spoken language, most people read more than they write. In fact, most students read even more different kinds of text than they listen to, including social media posts, news reports, blogs, text messages, editorials, novels, email messages, magazine articles, product reviews, and advertisements, as well as school texts like textbook, research articles, course syllabi, and other written assignments or handouts. This course investigate the language used in these different kinds of text, both its spoken and written. You will see how almost any kind of text has its own characteristic linguistic features. For example, it would not be surprising to end a conversation with the following utterances: "Okay, see you later." But it would be almost inconceivable that this sentence would end a textbook. Rather, language like the following is much more typical. Processes of producing and understanding discourse are matters of human feeling and human interaction, and understanding of these processes in language will contribute to our rational as well as ethical and humane basis for understanding what it means to be human. The concluding two sentence from Tannen 2005. How are these two examples different linguistically, and why do those differences exist? These questions are central to the analysis of text varieties, registers, genres, and style. The focus of the focus of the present course. We use the term register, genre, and style to refer the three different perspectives on the text varieties. The register perspective combines an analysis of linguistic characteristics that are common in a text variety with analysis of the situation of use of the variety. The underlying assumption of the register perspective is that core linguistic features, pronouns, and verbs serve communicative function. As a result, some linguistic features are common in a register because they are functional adapted to the communicative purposes and situational context of text from the register. In In contrast, the general perspective focuses on the conventional structures used to construct a complete text within the variety. For example, the conventional way in which a letter begins and ends. The style perspective is similar to the register perspective in its linguistic focus, analyzing the use of linguistic features that are common in text, but the key difference from the register perspective is that the use of these linguistic features is not functional motivated, rather, style features reflect aesthetic preferences associated with particular authors or historical periods. The present course focuses mostly on the register perspective because the perspective is important for the description of all text varieties. That is, any text sample of any type can be analyzed from register perspective because the other two perspectives are more specialized. We provide a less thorough treatment of their characteristics. However, we include discuss of those perspectives at several places in the course when they are especially useful for understanding the text variety being described. For example, the style perspective is especially useful for comparing fictional prose written by different authors, and the general perspective is especially useful for discussing the structure of academic research articles. We return to a much fuller introduction of the three perspective in section 1.4. However, we first take up several more basic issues relating to the study of text varieties and their general role in language and societies. 1.1.1. Why is it important to analyze text varieties? As a native speaker of a language, you acquired many text varieties without explicitly studying them. For example, nobody explained formal rules for having conversations or how the rules change when you conversed with your closest friend rather than your mother, or when you conversed via text message rather than spoken language. However, many other varieties are usually learned with explicit instruction. For example, if you are training for a job as a preacher, you will probably explicitly learn about the discourse styles of sermon. Similarly, if you are training for a job as a journalist, you will learn about the written conversation of effective news reports. One of the most important goals of formal education is to teach text varieties that might not be acquired outside of school. Even before going to school, most children are exposed to written stories and learn how narratives are different from normal conversation. Early in school, children learn to read books of many different types, including fictional stories, historical recounts of past events, and description of natural phenomena. These varieties rely on different linguistic structures and patterns, and students must learn how to recognize and interpret those differences at the same time. Primarily, primary school students must learn how to produce some of these different varieties. For example, writing a narrative essay on what they did during summer vacation versus a persuasive essay on whether the school cafeteria should sell candy. The amount of explicit instruction in different text varieties varies across teachers, schools, and countries, but even a young age, students must somehow learn to control and interpret the language of different varieties, or they will not succeed at school. Textual tasks become more and more demanding as a student progresses through school. A university education requires the ability to read and understand academic prose, a variety that is extremely different from face to face conversational. Further, students must learn how to produce written text from the many different specific subvarieties within academic prose, including persuasive essays in first year composition, love reports in science courses, and summary synthesis prose responses of on final exam. One of the main goal of a university education is to learn the specialized register of a particular pro- profession, whether electrical engineering, chemistry, sociology, finance, or English education. Success required learning the particular language patterns that are expected for particular situation and communicative purposes. The task of learning register or general differences in is even more challenging for a non-native speaker of a language. For example, thousands of students speak languages other than English, but choose to attend a university where the primary language of education is English. In the USA, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore, India, etc. Traditionally, these students were taught general vocabulary and grammatical rules of English in preparation for advanced study. However, in recent years, many applied linguists have come to realize that this is not enough to ensure student success. Students also need knowledge of register or general differences to succeed in their university education. This awareness have given rise to the field of English for academic purposes EAP, which focuses on teaching the English language skills that are especially helpful for the registers or genera used in universities. Similarly, the field of English for specific purposes or ESP focuses on description of the language used in registers and genres from a particular profession, nursing or civil engineering, a particular academic discipline such as biochemistry or physical therapy. The ultimate goal of EAP and ESP research is to develop instructional material that will help students learn the particular language pattern that are typical for the different kinds of text is those fields, but even proficiency with specific written registers or genres is not enough for students and professionals. Some non-native speakers are criticized for sounding too much like a book when they speak. Thus, proficiency with spoken registers for conversations and meeting is also important. Register genres and style differences are fundamentally important for any student with a primary interest in language. For example, any student majoring in English or in the study of another language like Japanese or Spanish must understand the text varieties in the language. If you are training to become a teacher for secondary education or for TESOL, you will shortly be faced with the task of teaching your own student how to use the words and structures that are appropriate to different spoken and written tasks, different registers and genres. Other students of language are more interested in the study of literature or the creative writing of new literature. Issues relating to the style perspective, since the literary effects that distinguish one novel or poem from the text are realized as linguistic differences. While many literary scholars and creative writers become highly proficient without formal training in linguistic analysis, the tools provided in the present course provide an additional perspective for tasks. Overall, then the text varieties and differences among them constantly affected people's daily lives. Proficiency with these varieties aspects not only success as a student but also success as practitioner of any profession from engineering to creative writing to teaching. Receptive master Receptive mastery of different text varieties increases access to information, while productive mastery increases the ability to participate in varying communities. And if you cannot analyze a variety that is new to you, you cannot help yourself or others learn to master it. This course provides the foundational knowledge that you will need to effectively analyze, understand, and teach awareness of differences among text varieties. 1.2 Text varieties, registers, and dialects. Variability is inherent in human language. People use different linguistic forms on different occasions, and different speakers of a language will say the same thing in different ways. Most of this linguistic variation is highly systematic. A speaker of a language make choices in pronunciation, morphology, word choice, and grammar depending on a number of non-linguistic factors. These factors include the speaker's purpose in communication, the relationship between speaker and hearer, the production circumstances, and the social characteristic of the speaker. At the high at the highest level, linguistic variation is realized as different languages, Korean, French, Shawali. At the lowest level, linguistic variation is realized as the differences between one speaker compared to another speaker, or as the differences between two texts produced by the same speaker. In the present course, we use the term text to refer to natural language used for communication, whether it is realized in speech or writing. Thus, a research paper is a text, as is a novel or news report. In speech, a sermon and a face-to-face conversation are both text. The notion of text is somewhat fluid as we use it here. First of all, we something distinguish between a complete text and excerpt. A complete text is an instance of extended discourse that has a clear start and finish, such as a research article or a sermon. However, many of the texts that we discussed in the course are actually text excerpts, segment of discourse extracted from a larger complete text. Thus, we might discuss a excerpt of 2 to 3 paragraphs from a novel or several turns of interaction from a conversation. Further, the notion of complete text is in itself somewhat fluid. First, text can be considered at different levels of generality. Thus, a chapter in a book might be considered a complete text, but The entire book might also be considered as a complete text. Similarly, in spoken language, a joke told during a sermon might be considered as a complete text, but the entire sermon can also be treated as a complete text. Beyond that, the boundaries of complete text are not always explicit or clear cut. This is especially the case in speech. For example, suppose you are having a conversation with your friend Trisha and her friend Amy walks up and joins the conversation. A little later, you need to leave, but Trisha and Amy continue to talk. How many conversations have there been? And where are the boundaries of each? For example, did the conversation between Trisha and Amy begin when Amy arrived or when you left? In the following modules, we use the notion of complete text in cases where it is relatively clearly cut, such as a complete research article that has a distinct beginning and ending. In other cases, we use the more general term text as a cover term for any extended segment of discourse from speech or writing. Texts can be described according to their context, considering the characteristics of the people who produce the text and characteristic of the situation and communicating purposes associated with the text. The general term variety is used for a category of text that shares some people or situational characteristic. For example, a national variety of English refers to the text produced by the speakers of English who reside in a specific country: British English, Australian English, India English, etc. Much of the research in sociolinguistics has focused on varieties that are associated with different groups of speakers. People who live in different geographic regions, different socioeconomic classes, ethnic groups, women versus men, etc. These socially defined varieties are referred to as dialects. The present course deals instead with text varieties that occur in particular situation of use registers, genres, and styles. Our primary focus in this course is the notion of register and process of register analysis introduction in the following section. However, we return to a fuller discussion of dialect versus registers in section 1.34. 1.3 Registers and Register Analysis and Overview. As noted above, we focus primarily on the register perspective in this course because it can be used to describe any text excerpt from any variety. However, the methodological techniques used for register analysis are also applicable to the genre and style perspectives. In the present section, we provide an overview of register analysis, establishing the foundation that will be used throughout the course. Then, in section 1.4, we provide a much fuller introduction to the genre and style perspective in comparison to the register perspective. 1.3.1 Register Analysis Situation Linguistic Features Functions. In general terms, a register is a variety associated with a particular situation of use, including particular communicating purposes. The description of a register covers three major components: the situational context, the linguistic features, and the functional relationships between the first two components. Figure 1.1. Registers are described for their typical lexical and grammatical characteristic, their linguistic features, but registers are also described for their situational context, for example, whether they are produced in speech or writing, whether they are interactive, and what their primarily communicating purposes are. One of the central arguments of the course is that linguistic features are always functional when considered from a register perspective, that is, linguistic features tend to occur frequently in a register because they are particularly well suited to the purposes and situational context of the register. Thus, the third component of anything register description is the functional analysis. Registers can be identified and described based on analysis of their complete text or a collection of text excerpts. This is because the linguistic component of a register analysis requires identification of the pervasive linguistic features in the variety. Linguistic characteristics that might occasionally occur in any text but are especially common in target register. It is these pervasive linguistic features that are clearly functional as exemplified below. Situational varieties can also be described by analyzing language features that characterize complete text referred to as the general perspective in the present course. General features are not pervasive. Rather, they might occur only one time in a complete text, often at the beginning or end of the text. They are also often situational context of use, including communicative purposes. Linguistic analysis of the linguistic analysis of the words and structures that commonly occur. Function. Conventional rather than functional. Section 1.4 provides a fuller discussion of the similarities and differences between a genera and register perspective on situational varieties. The methodological process for analyzing registered can be briefly illustrated by considering face-to-face conversation. The first step is to describe the situation characteristics of the register, focusing especially on characteristics that distinguish it from other registers. Face-to-face conversational requires direct interaction between two people who are together at the same time in the same place, at least electronically. Bo- Both participants must speak or the conversation would become a monologue. Furthermore, while many specific topics and purposes are possible, it is generally appropriate for participants to discuss event thoughts and opinions related to their personal lives or something in immediate context. The second step is to describe the typical persuasive linguistic features of the register. This step requires consideration of multiple texts from the target register to discover the linguistic features that are frequent across text and not characteristic of only single text. For example, three linguistic features are especially common in converse conversation. First person pronouns I and we. Second person pronouns you. and questions. Finally, the third step of a register analysis is to interpret the relationship between the situational characteristic and the pervasive linguistic feature in text sample 1.1 conversational among group of friends walking to a restaurant. Judith. Yeah, I just found out that Rebecca is going to the University of Chicago to get her PhD. I really want to go visit her. Maybe I'll come out and see her. Eric. Oh, is she? Judith. Yeah, Eric. Oh, good. Elias. Here, do you want one? Offering a candy. Judith. What kind is it? Elias. Cinnamon. Judith. Oh, Kate, those are good. Eric. They're good. Elias. That's the joy of life. Kate. Did you did you guys come through the plaza on your way? Judith. No. Kate, you have to go through it on your way home. It probably would be empty. Elias, we drove through it tonight. Judith, yeah, well, do that. Eric, I don't like the color lights of the tree though. Kate, did they put fake ones up in there 1 year? Elias, no, they're just all around on all the buildings. Kate, oh yeah. Elias, I think it would be kind of dumb to put them on the ground. Functional terms. To make this functional concrete, consider text sample 1.1, a typical passage of conversation. In this passage, the specific topics switch abruptly, but throughout the interaction and participants are discussing their own thoughts, attitudes, and actions. With first person pronouns, I just found out, I really want, I don't like, I think, and they use second person pronouns to address each other. Do you want? Did you guys? Questions are used as part of the direct interaction with each other, often incorporating the use of first and second person pronouns. These linguistic features are especially frequent in conversation because they have a functional relationship to the situational context, which involves interactions between two participants, I and you. The characteristic of a register become easier to identify if any analysis contrasts two different registers, for example, in contrast to the speaker in conversational. The author of a news report is not addressing a specific person, and there is no direct interaction between a specific reader and the author. It is also not normally relevant for the news author to describe her own personal feelings or other aspects of her personal life. As a result of these functional considerations, there are normally few first and second pronouns and question in the news reports. These differences illustrated a key aspect of register analysis that we will return to repeatedly throughout the course. The characteristic of any individual register become much more apparent when it is compared to other registers. 1.3.2 More details about registers and register analysis. The last section introduced the notion of register as a variety associated with a particular situation of use, including particular communicating purposes. The description of a register has three major components: the situational communicative description, the description of pervasive linguistic features, and the analysis of the function associated between linguistic forms and situational context. A few points deserve further develop here. 1.3.2.1. The situational characteristic of registers are more basic than the linguistic features. Registers differ in both their situational and linguistic characteristic. However, the situational characteristic are more basic. All speakers are language in different contexts under different circumstances for different purposes. Those patterns of behavior cannot be derived from any linguistic phenomena. In contrast, the linguistic differences among registers can be derived from situational differences between linguistic features are functional. For example, imagine what it would be like if the linguistic consideration were primary. In that case, you might be sitting at your computer and suddenly feel like producing a text with lots of pronouns I and you and lots of questions, and only later realize that such a text must occur in conversational context. So, you would go around looking for someone to have a conversation with. Obviously, this is not how communication works. Rather, you find yourself in a conversational situation, and because of that, you start to produce language with the linguistic features that are appropriate for a conversation. Module 2 will introduce a framework for the situational analysis of registers, including the role of culture in defining them, but even this briefly example illustrates how registers are determined by their situational characteristics. 1.3.2.2 registers differs in quantitative distribution of pervasive linguistic features, not the single occurrence of an individual feature. We will have much more to say about how to analyze the linguistic features of a register in Module 3, but it is important to note from the outset that very few registers can be identified by unique lexical and grammatical features. Instead, to carry out the linguistic analysis of a register, you must consider the extent to which linguistic features are used in order to identify the linguistic features that are pervasive and especially common in the target register. For example, it is not the case that conversation always uses pronouns and never uses nouns, or the news reports always use nouns and never any pronouns. Instead, both registers use both nouns and pronouns. However, conversation uses more pronouns and fewer nouns, while news reports use more nouns and fewer pronouns. In other words, the relative distribution of noun and pronoun differs greatly between conversation and news report. The linguistic analysis of registers is based on such differences in the relative distribution of linguistic features, which are especially common and pervasive in some register but comparatively rare in other registers. 1.3.2.3 Register analysis requires both situational and linguistic analysis, often applied cyclically. In a register analysis, both the situational components and the linguistic features are explicitly described. The functional interpretation then is based on comparison of the situational and linguistic analysis. New register studies usually begin with at least some analysis of the situational characteristic, as Module 2 will explain in more detail. Initially, analysis of the situational characteristic can be important for selecting appropriate text samples to include in a study. However, often in a register analysis, you will find that there are surprises resulting from the linguistic analysis. Certain linguistic features will occur more frequently or rarely than you expected. These unexpected linguistic patterns will often require that you reassess the situational characteristic of the register, especially with respect to less obvious characteristic like the communicative purpose. Thus, the process of register analysis is often iterative. Text sample 1.2 Working Class Conversation, Hampshire, England. Well, what's the alternative? Why? What's the alternative? She either gets on with it or gets rid of them, don't she? Well, no. It's simple. She can insulate the house. Well, that don't stop it from getting on her nerves, does it? Yeah, but it don't get on her nerves. That's the whole point. She's obviously able to throw it off. She's in the meat. Hmm. And when we hear it in her here, she's got it worse in their cause she's in there. Yeah, but that yesterday afternoon you'd have thought the bloody things were in here, wouldn't you? Yes, that was two of them, but yeah. Text sample 1.3 Middle class conversation, Devon, England. Pauline. See, I was thinking this was gonna cost a lot of money to put the phones in. But it's not, because you just put online in the then put different bits up the line, don't you, Bob? No, no, they come in separate lines, Pauline. But you cut it, Bob. You charge per. It here it's not just one line with four connection. They charge you per phone. I was thinking the Desmond about it, and he reckoned that once you've got your line you can muck about and put quiet a few lines in there. No, no, doesn't work like that. Oh, you can use the same, you can see the same number, all right? Hmm. Eh, the same number of four lines, but if you were want to go out, four people were to phone in at the one time. Oh, of course not. Of course yes. Do you see what I mean? I see what you mean. You've got to have four separate lines. The speakers in these two conversations are from different social dialect and different geographic dialects. If you heard the conversation, the speakers would probably sound quite different, but there is only one obvious grammatical dialect marker that distinguishes the two. The use of don't with a third person singularly subject in the working class conversation. That don't stop it. It don't get on her nerves, because dialect markers such as there are often highly stigmatized, a relatively rare occurrence of a few features can serve as an important indicator of dialect differences. Overall, though, the most striking aspect of comparison between the two conversations is how similar they are. Situational, the two conversations were very similar in their production circumstances, primary purposes, and interactiveness. Both conversations are spoken rather than written, and they are produced in real time with the word and grammatical organization between produced on the spot as the conversation unfolds. There is little time to plan ahead and virtually no opportunity to edit afterwards. In addition, both conversations are personal and directly interactive. Conversational partners express their own personal attitudes, feelings, and concerns, and they interact with one another to build a shared discourse. The characteristics are tied to conversation as a register and rare thus not affected by dialect differences. The contextual characteristics shared by these two conversations has important linguistic correlates, and as a result the conversation are very similar linguistically. For example, the speaker in both conversation are planning what to say at the same time that they are actually speaking. As a result, both conversational have generally short sentences, and many utterances are not structurally complete sentences or at all. Assuming the traditional concept of grammatical sentence, this letter includes simple responses why, yeah, no, oh, of course, as well as utterances that build on the shared physical context to supply missing information. Doesn't work like that. Both conversational also have numerous contracted or reduced forms such as what's, it's, she's, that's, don't, you've, cause, gonna. In addition, the participants in both conversation assume familiarity with other people and the physical context as a result. References to people, objective, and places are often not explicitly identified. She either gets on with it or gets rid of them. Put quiet a few lines in there. The interactive nature of conversation results in further linguistic similarities between these two texts. For example, both conversations have frequent ref- references to I, the speaker, and you, the addresses. Similarly, there are frequent questions in both. What's the alternative? Why? What does it? Wouldn't you? Do you see what I mean? Don't you? All right. The extent of the similarities between these two conversations from different dialects can be further illustrated by comparing them to a sample from a written informational register. Text sample 1.4 is taken from a university textbook. Text Sample 1.4 Text Analysis Textbook. The method for information systems inquiry, known colloquially as MINSE, by the research project team, specifically addresses the problem of structuring the approach to information studies. It uses system thinking to develop ideas about what information is needed to achieve a defined purpose, ideas that are independent in the first instance of how this information appears in practice. In the process, an information model is built up on a computer database, which is used as a framework to explore the situation and identify problems at a number of levels. Figure 11.1. The situational characteristics of the textbook are very different from those of the conversational. The text is produced in writing, carefully planned, revised, and edited. The text is not interactive. it is addressed to a large audience of students and professionals, but the writer and audience are not directly involved with each other. The primary purpose of text is to represent information about system analysis as opposed to the interpersonal purposes of conversational participants. Due to the influence of these situational factors, the linguistic characteristics of the textbook are dramatically different from those of the conversational text. The sentences of the textbook are all grammatically complete and are often quite long and complex. None of the reduced or interactive linguistic characteristics common in conversation occur in this text. However, textbook to contain numerous linguistic characteristics rarely found in conversation. In text sample 1.4, these linguistics features include passive constructions, known colloquially as is, is built up, is then used, and complex noun phrase construct. The problem of structuring the approach to information studies, a computer database, which is then used as a framework to explore the situation and identify problems at a number of levels. The extensive linguistic differences between this textbook and the conversations reflect and fundamental importance of register associated with contextual differences in production, circumstances, purpose, interactiveness, etc. These contextual factors operate in similar ways in all dialects, thus, conversation is essentially the same regardless of the dialect of the speaker. Similarly, academic writing is essentially the same regardless of whether the writer uses a British or American dialect. There are, of course, some differences in pronunciation and word choice associated with different dialects, and there are even occasional differences in grammar. But these differences are minor when compared to the major linguistic differences among different registers associated with different situation of use. 1.4, different perspectives and text varieties, register genre style. In section 1.1, we briefly distinguish among the register genre and style perspective on text. In the following section, we further clarify how we use these terms in the present course. However, the terms register genre and style have been used in many different ways by previous researchers. Thus, in section 1.4.2 and 1.4.3, we survey the use of these terms in previous research and when necessarily clarify the contrast with our perspective here. 1.4.1, register genre and style perspective in this course. As noted above, we regard genre, register, and style as different approaches or perspective for analyzing text varieties and not as different kinds of text or different varieties. In fact, the same text can be analyzed from register, genre, and style perspectives as shown in the table 1.1. The three perspectives differ in four major ways with respect to 1. The text considered for the analysis. Second, the linguistic characteristics considered for the analysis. Third, the distribution of those linguistic characteristics. And fourth, the interpretation of linguistic differences. In the genre perspective, the focus is on the linguistic characteristics that are used to structure complete text, while in both the register perspective and the style perspective, the focus is on the pervasive linguistic characteristic of representative text excerpts from a variety as summarized in table 1.1. Table 1.1 Defining characteristic of registers, genres, and style. Defining characteristic: textual focus, linguistic characteristic, distribution of linguistic characteristic, interpretation. Register: sample of text excerpts, any lexicogrammatical feature, frequent and pervasive in text from the variety. Features serve important communicative function in the register. Genre: complete text, specialized expression, rhetorical organization, formatting. Usually once occurring in the text in a particular place in the text. Features are conventionally associated with the genre, the expected format, but often not functional. The style: sample of text excerpts, any lexicogrammatical feature, frequent and pervasive in text from the variety. Features are not directly functional, they are preferred because they are aesthetically valued. The register perspective characterizes the typical linguistic features of text varieties and connects those features functionally to the situational context of the variety because the focus is on words and grammatical features that are frequent and pervasive. The analysis can be based on a sample of text excerpts rather than complete text. In contrast to the focus of the register perspective, the genre perspective usually focuses on language characteristics that occur only one in a text. These features serve a crucial role in how texts from a particular variety are constructed. For this reason, genre studies must be based on analysis of complete text from the variety. These language features are conventionally associated with the genre. They conform to the culturally expected way of constructing text belonging to the variety. For example, a genre study of business letters would analyze the expected textual conversation conventions for complete letters. These conventions include the expectations that the letter will be begin with the date at the top, followed by the name and address and the recipient, followed by a salutation and title Dear Dr. Jones, followed by main body of the letter. The letter will then close with some kind of politeness expression, sincerely, followed by the signature of the letter writer. These conventions are part of what define a letter, and they can be identified only by considering complete letters. The general perspective often focuses on the rhetorical organization of text from a variety, especially the rhetorical convention of written varieties. For example, by convention, a front page newspaper story begins with a concise title and the name of the place where the story occurred. The prose text opens with one to two sentences that summarize the main event that has occurred and the significances of that event. The text then has multiple paragraphs, each describing some aspects of the story, how the event came about, the background of the main participants, direct and indirect quotations, how other participants become involved, consequences of the event, etc. These paragraphs are usually very short and self-contained. All of these genre features are exemplified in text sample 1.5. Text sample 1.5 newspaper investigation investigators take last Look at subway wreck age. Philadelphia, AP. A subway car derailment that killed three people and injured 162 may have been triggered by a dragging motor that hit attacks, which federal investigators said Thursday. The alternate switch may have sent the last three cars in the six-car train onto another set of tracks Wednesday, causing one car to be yanked into steel support beams, said John K. Lauber of the National Transportation Safety Board. Evidence indicated the motor dropped when a nut came loose. Lauber said, adding the investigators were told that subway motors had dropped from their supports three times in the last 15 years, most recently just a month ago. That probably resulted in the pivoting of the motor under the car, and that probably was the initiation of the accident, he said. A 37 block section of West Philadelphia's 12.8-mile subway and elevated train line, a major commuter artery in the nation's largest city, remained closed Thursday as federal investigators made their final inspection of the wreckage. Extra buses were pressed into service to handle some of the 100,000 people who typically ride the line twice a day. LSWE Corpus. The general conversations of online newspapers are slightly different, usually beginning with the title and the name of the author, often with a photo image of the author, but no identification of the location. The news story itself, though, is in many cases identically to the news article printed in newspapers. The Register and General's perspective to identify the linguistic characteristic associated with the general perspective. The text excerpts are not adequate for genre analysis because they do not necessarily represent the linguistic conventions that define the genre, the conventional ways to begin or end a text. In contrast, any text sample can be analyzed from a register perspective, considering the typical linguistic features associated with the situational context. The linguistic features occur throughout text from a register, and so complete texts are not required to analyze register characteristic from example. For example, text sample 1.1 to 1.4 are all excerpts that illustrate the use of pervasive register features like constructions, pronouns, and questions in conversation. Complete texts that are analyzed from a general perspective can also be analyzed from a register perspective. For example, text sample 1.5, which illustrate the general for conventions for opening a newspaper story, also illustrated the linguistic characteristics that are typical of the register of news reporting. These linguistic features include past tense verb killed, injured, said, indicated, passive voice verb being triggered, were told, were press, and reporter speech, both direct quotes and indirect report speech. These features are pervasive in news reports distributed throughout this text, and thus they can be identified in either complete text or text excerpts. Finally, the style perspective is similar to the register perspective in that it considers the typical linguistic features associated with a collection of text sample from a variety. The two perspectives differ in their interpretation, that is, in the underlying reason for the observed linguistic patterns. The systematic linguistic patterns associated with the register perspective exist because linguistic variation is functional. Linguistic features are used frequently in a register when they are required by the situational characteristic of the register, as described in section 1.3. In contrast, the the linguistic patterns associated with the styles are not functional. Rather, these are features associated with aesthetic preferences influenced by the speaker or writer attitudes about language. That is, a speaker or author often has attitudes about what constitutes good style, resulting in the manipulating of language for aesthetic purposes. Styles are normally described for the text within a register or genre. The most common application of this concept is to describe systematic variation with the register genre of fiction. However, a similar notion of style has been used to study variation within the register of conversation, where each subculture style, see Tanman 2005, meaning that they have different norms for how they usually structures a conversation relating to different speech rates, different pause lengths between turns, whether overlapping speech is considered to be polite or not, etc. Particularly, fictional style are often associated with individual authors. For example, authors like Virginia Woolf and Toni Morrison preferred a fictional style with extremely long, complex sentences mixed in with very short, single clause sentences. In contrast, an author like Ernest Hemingway preferred a style with consistently short, simple sentences. Both styles can also be associated with different groups of authors of different historical period. For example, in Module 8, we discussed how fictional style in the 18th century was generally different from contemporary fictional style. The key point here is that these differences are not fictional. For example, the situational context for a novel written by all authors is essentially the same. Rather, these linguistic differences are stylistic, reflecting differing attitudes towards language or attempts to achieve different aesthetic effects through the manipulating of language. As noted above, the same text or varieties can be considered from register, genre, and style perspective. For example, a genre perspective on scientific research articles would describe the conventional rhetorical structure of complete articles, how they begin with a title, the author name, and an abstract followed by the introduction, method, section, results, discussion, or conclusions, and then concluding with a bibliography. However, these same scientific research articles can be studied from a register perspective, identifying the core linguistic features that are pervasive in this kind of writing: long noun phrases, no, nominalization, space, passive verbs, and explaining the preference for those linguistic features in functional term by reference to the production circumstances of writing and the typical communicative purposes of research articles, and the same text can be studied from a style perspective or a identifying the linguistic features associated with a particular author or a particular historical period in association with notions of good writing or prose that is aesthetically pleasing. 1.4.2 Genre and Style in Literary Studies. If you have experience with literary studies, you are probably already familiar with the concept of literary genre varieties of literature that employ different textual conventions. This use of the term genre is similar to our use in the present course because of the emphasis of textual conventions. For example, three major literary genres are poetry, drama, and fiction prose. Read through text samples 1.6 to 1.8 and make note of any textual conventions that distinguish among these genres. Text sample 1.6 Poetry. Credo. Goals are funnels with walls that narrow, and finally at the neck the achievement a guillotine. Better than goals are dreams that can never be attained, only live or dream. 1.3.2.4 Register variation has a functional basis. The linguistic differences among register are not arbitrary. For example, it is not sufficient to merely note that the language of conversation has many second person pronouns and questions, but it is an accepted convention to use these features in conversation. Rather, register analysis always include description of the situational context and functional interruption of why particular linguistic features commonly occur in the context. The functional associations between linguistic patterns and situational factors are at the heart of studying register variation and are further discussed in Module 3. 1.3.2.5 Registers can be identified on different levels of specificity. A register can be extremely general, like textbooks, but what about textbooks in linguistics or graduate level? Textbooks in sociolinguistics. In fact, any these can be identified as register. There is no single correct level on which to identify a register. Rather, it depends on the goals of your study. You may want to characterize the register of academic prose, a very general register. Or you may be interested in only research articles, a more specific register within academic prose, or you might focus on medical research articles, or even only the methods sections of experimental medical research articles. All of these can be considered registers, differing in their levels of generality. As a register category becomes more specific, it is possible to identify its situational and linguistic characteristic more precisely. Module 2 will have much more to say about general versus specialized registers. At this point, it is simply important to realize that registers can be studied on many different levels of specificity. 1.3.2.6 Register analysis must be based on a representative sample of text because a register analysis seeks to characterize a variety of language, not a particular text or an individual writer's styles. It must be based on analysis of a sample of text selected to represent the register as fully as possible. In many places in this course, we amplify what is known about certain registers with single short text passages. These texts have been carefully chosen to represent what previous research has shown to be typical in the register. At other places, we introduce some small case studies that show what you could do on your own, and we include many practice activities that task you to work with a small number of short texts. Again, we have deliberately selected the text in these activities to be represent of the more general pattern for the target registers based on previous research studies. In fact, many intriguing results can come from small register analysis. However, you should always remember that you cannot generalize to a register from an analysis with a small number of texts unless you have supporting evidence from larger scale studies. We will have much more to say about representativeness and small versus large scale register analysis in Module 3. 1.3.3 Registers versus Dialects. When asked to think about the different varieties of a language, like different varieties of English, many people immediately think of dialects. For example, it is easy to notice that people from the Southeast United States talk differently from people in Wales, and that the English used in Singapore is different from both. Two main kinds of dialects are commonly distinguished in linguistics. Geography dialects are varieties associated with speakers living in a particular location, while social dialects are varieties associated with speakers belonging to a particular demographic group, women versus men, or different social classes. Ma- Many recent dialects studies have used a comparative approach to study social dialects, describing the linguistic patterns of variation across social groups in major urban centers such as New York City, Norwich, Belfast, and Montreal. When dialects are studied, Analysis, analysts usually focus on linguistic features that are not associated with meaning differences. Phonological differences are often studied, such as pronouncing or omitting the R in park. Clearly, this phonological variation results in no meaning difference, though it does say a great deal about the region or social group that the speaker identifies with. Similar, the grammatical and lexical features included in studies of dialect variation are selected so that they do not reflect meaning differences. The use of double negatives in African American vernacular English versus single negatives in mainstream upper middle class English, or the use of synonymous words like soda versus pop versus soft drinks. Such linguistic differences are not functional, rather, sociolinguistics argue that these are arbitrary differences where one linguistic from unconventionally associated with a social group. In this regard, the linguistic variables used in register studies are exactly the opposite from those used in dialect studies. Register variables are functional as opposed to dialect variables, which are conventional. This difference is reflected in the way that linguistic variables are operationally defined in the two subfields. Linguistic variables in dialect studies almost always consist of a choice between two linguistic variants. The variable score is a proportion showing the relative preference for one or the other variant. In contrast, linguistic variables in register studies are usually rates of occurrence for a linguistic feature in a text, and higher rate of occurrence is interpreted as reflecting a greater need for the function associated with the feature. It is, of course, possible to investigate the existence of functionally motivated linguistic variation across dialects. However, most sociolinguists exclude this possibility because of their theoretically philosophically stance that all dialects are equivalent in their communicative potential. We return to this controversy in Module 10. 1.3.4 Comparing register variation and dialect variation. Although most sociolinguistic studies have traditionally focused on linguistic differences among dialects, the linguistic differences among registers are actually more extensive. When speakers switch between registers, they are not doing different things with language, using language for different communicative purposes and producing language under different circumstances. The associated linguistic differences are functionally motivated, related to these differing purposes and situational, and thus the linguistic differences among registers are often dramatic. In contrast, dialect differences are largely conventional, expressing a person identity within a social group regardless of any dialect's differences. Speakers using the same register are doing similar communicative tasks. Therefore, in most basic respects, the characteristic language features used in a given situation are similar across speakers from different dialects. To illustrate, compare the language used in the following two conversations: one between a working class husband and wife in Hampshire, England, text sample 1.2, and the second between a middle class husband and wife in Devon, England, text sample 1.3. Text sample 1.7 drama. I'm going down to school with you. Oh no, you're not. You're going to keep company with the corpse in there. If she wakes up and starts gagging, just slip her a shot of whiskey. The taxi horn blows outside. Quick, grab the plants. Matilda, I'll get the big thing. I want to go. I promised Chris Burns I'd met him. Can't you understand English? I've got to go. Shut up! Almost brusque. I don't care. I'm going anyway. What did you say? Mother. Text sample 1.8 Fiction prose. I was living that year in a house on Yucca Avenue in the Laurel Canyon district. It was a small hillside house on a dead end street with a long flight of redwood steps to the front door and a grove of eucalyptus trees across the way. It was furnished, and it belonged to a woman who had gone to Idaho to live with her widowed daughter for a while. What do you notice about the differences among these three texts? The most obvious is probably the physical layout on the page. By convention, fictional prose is presented as paragraphs with an indentation at the start of the paragraph and each line filling the entire page. Fictional prose almost normal employs complete sentences and standard sentence punctuation. Drama has different conventions. It portrays conventional dialogue and so has a format, and first identifies who the speaker is, followed by the utterance for the speaker. Drama is intended to be performed in speech even though its origin is in writing. As a result, a dramatic text also includes language that gives instructions for the performance, identifying events that occur during a conversation. The taxi horn blows outside, shoving Ruth hard, or describing the manner of speaking that an actor should adopt, almost berserk. Poetry differs from both drama and prose in the physical arrangement of text on the page is part of the creative effect. Poetry can employ complete sentences, but the arrangement of line on the page is more important. Meaning relationship is poetry are often constructed from the physical juxtaposition of words and lines rather than through the use of complete sentences. And finally, the at the neck, the achievement a guillotine can never be attained, only live or dream. There is extensive linguistic variation among the texts with a literary genre, and this is where the style perspective becomes especially important to describe the characteristic discourse associated with different authors or time periods reflecting different aesthetic preferences. Like registers styles can be described in terms of the frequent and pervasive linguistic features used in different kinds of discourse. For example, 18th century fictional style is characterized by extremely long sentences, while 20th century fiction generally uses much shorter sentences. See Module 8. Author also differ is their characteristic style sometimes famously. For example, Defoe is well known for writing in a simple and plain style of fiction in contrast to the more typical styles of discourse in the early 18th 18th century. Johnson writing in the second half of the 18th century is instead known for a highly elaborated style of discourse. See the discussion of author style in fiction in Module 5 and 8. Literary styles can be studied using the same analytic techniques as registers. However, the underlying causes of the style variation are related to aesthetic preferences and attitudes among language rather than the more direct functional influence from the communicative situation. For the most part of our focus in the present course is on the analysis of every kind of speaking and writing rather than literature. However, in Module 5, we return to fiction prose describing some of its special situational and linguistic characteristic. Then in Module 8, we show how historical change in the literary styles of novels can be approached from a linguistic perspective. 1.4.3 Register, Genre and Style and Previous Research. The term register, genre, and style have been central to previous investigations of discourse, but they have been used in many different ways. Our treatment in the present course builds on their previous research, but it does not attempt to reconcile all previous definitions of these terms. As you read other studies, it is important to be aware that there is no general consensus concerning the use of the term register, and related terms such as genre, style. Register and genre have both been used to refer to varieties associated with particular situation of use and particular communicative purposes. Many studies simply adopt one of these terms and disregard the other. For example, Bieber 1988, Bathia 2002, Samra 2002 AB, Bonton 2002, Love 2002, and Suarez 1990 to 2004 exclusively use the term genre rather than register. In some of this study, Suarez 1990, the analysis focused primarily on the organizational structure of whole text, while in others, Bieber 1988, its focus on pervasive linguistic patterns. Other studies, Ure 1982, Ferguson 1983, Himes 1984, Health and Langman 1994, Brutax 1994 to 1996, Bieber 1995, Conrad 2001, and Bieber et al. 1999 exclusively use the term register. Some textbook is sociolinguistics through Gill 1974, Warda 1992 have used the term register in a highly restrictive sense to refer only to occupational varieties such as a computer programmer, talk, or auto mechanic talk. Relatively few earlier studies used both the terms register and genre, made a theoretical distinction between terms. Notable is work in systematic functional linguistics, a theoretical frame based on work by Hilda 1978, which is concerned with the interaction of form, function, and context in human communication. In this framework, genre and register are said to be a different semiotic planes. Martin 1985. Genre is viewed as a social process in which participants with a culture use language in predictable sequential structures to fulfill certain communicative purposes. Couture 1986-80 called genres conventional instances of organized text. Register, on the other hand, has been characterized as the expression plane of genre. Martin 1985, and is more concerned by the typical linguistic choices within different genres. The choices are seen as resulting from contextually variable called field, tenor, and mode in systematic functional linguistics, which roughly mean topics, actions of language, participants' relationships, and textual organization. The distinction between register and genre in the present course shares some characteristics that this term in systematic functional linguistics, especially with respect to the general perspective, emphasizing the conventional feature of whole text, while the register perspective emphasizes variation in the use of linguistic features. See all Ferguson 1994. Systematic functional linguistics, however, has an extensive theoretical framework associated with this concept. See Halliday 1978, 1989, Martin 1985, 1997, 2001, Mathisen 1993. Finally, another perspective on the study of genres has an entirely different focus from the present course, sometimes called the New Rhetoric Approach, Heelan 2002a. This perspective is more concerned with the sociocultural context of different message types and the work that genres do, rather than describing linguistic characteristic of text. In such studies, an ethnographic description of particular community and the use of learning of genres within Artemeva 2008 are more typical than linguistic description. While such studies are interesting for what they tell about how much language use is situated in sociocultural context, they are less relevant for our purposes in the present course, which focuses more narrowly on the linguistic analysis of text. The term styles has perhaps been used for an even wider range of concept than either of the other terms. In the 1960s, descriptive linguists used the term style to refer to general situation varieties similar to our use of register in the present course. See Joss 1961, Crystal and Davy 1969. Quantitative sociolinguists in the Labovian tradition use the term style to refer the language used for different purposes during a sociolinguistic interview. Sociolinguistic style are interpreted as reflecting production circumstances that require differing amounts of attention to speech. Reading word list versus an interview. See Labor 1966-1972. In our final module, we return to a fuller discussion of socio-linguistic style variation in comparison to register variation, see section 9.4. More commonly, style has been treated as a characteristic way of using language. This general perspective has most often been applied to literary language, often referred to as stylistic. Style in this sense has been studied as characteristic of particular genres, particular periods, particular authors, and even particular texts. See E.G. Leach and Short 1981, Freeborn 1996, Paul Simpson 2004. This usage can also carry an evaluative sense as when writing handbooks, discussion writing with style, which carries the implication that many people write without style. Finally, as noted above, a similar notion of style has been used to study conversational interactions where culture can be described as having distinctive conversational styles. Tannen 2005. A number of publications are available for learning more about research and theorist use of this term. Useful places to start include the General Overviews in Lee 2001 and Highland 2002, 10, 22, while Noonan 2008 provides an accessible introduction to the concept of genre and register in systematic functional linguistics. 1.5 Register genre variation as a linguistic universal. All culture use language for different communicative purposes in different situations. Register variation focuses on the pervasive patterns of linguistic variation across such situations in association with the functions served with linguistic features. Genres variation focuses on the conventional ways in which complete texts of different types are structured. Taken together, registered genre variation is a fundamental aspect of human language. All culture and language have an array of registers and genres, and all human control a range of registers and genres. The universal nature of registered genres variation has been noted by many previous scholars. For example, register variation in which language structures varies in accordance with the occasion of use is all pervasive in human language. By Ferguson, 1983, 154. No human being talks the same way all the time. Variety of registers and styles is used and encountered. Himes, 1984-44. Each language community has its own system of registers corresponding to the range of activities in which its members normally engage. Ure 1982-5. Given the ubiquity of registered genres variation, an understanding of how linguistic features are used in pattern ways across text varieties is of central importance of both the description of particular languages and the development of cross-linguistic theories of language use. Himes argues that the analysis of register or genre variation, verbal repertoire, in his term should become the major focus of research with linguistics. The socio-linguistic perspective has the possibility of taking to lead the transforming the study of language through developing and consolidating the systematic study of verbal repertoire. The ability of individual and the composite ability of communities cannot be understood as except by making verbal repertoire, not language, the central scientific notion. Himes, 1984-44. Registered genre variation is universal because all cultures use language in different situations for different communicative purposes. In the module, we have repeatedly noted that we regard the register perspective as the most important because linguistic features are functional, they are used to be great and lesser extent in different situations, and thus any text sample of any type can be described from the register perspective. This functional association between linguistic forms and situations of use result in the systematic patterns of register variation. The primarily goal of the present course is thus to introduce you to this linguistic pattern and to equip you with the tool needed to carry out your own register analysis. In addition, we will continue to describe pattern of general variation and style variation, especially when those perspectives provide useful insights of particular text variety.